And we're going to keep it up. We've got a couple more panels, and then that's going to be our day. But I just want to say as a quick note to the funders in the room or watching online, sometimes when we as nonprofits say that we're holding ourselves together with Scotch tape and popsicle sticks to do this work, it's literal. You can see it right here. So we are pulling this off with a lean operation, and we appreciate your support. So now we're going to transition and switch gears to our next conversation, which is going to be very much future thinking, but also very much the present moment, because the future is here now. And that's around AI and emerging technology and how that is showing up in the context of benefits. I'm going to go ahead and call our next panel up to the stage while I introduce the moderator of that panel. I'm very excited for this conversation and for what each of these brilliant folks is going to bring to the table. I will also say, I feel like each of these panels could be its own whole day conference, and this one is definitely no exception. But we are so grateful to the brilliant Natalie Alms at GovExec, who is a newer reporter working on benefits issues and tech, for fearlessly leading this next conversation. And if you're not familiar with Natalie's work, you probably are and don't know it, because she wrote that really important story last year, finding that 30,000 people had died waiting for disability benefits because of backlogs, which will be part of the conversation today. So Natalie, I'm going to let you introduce the panel and take it away.
For having me. Again, my name is Natalie Alms. As Rebecca said, I'm a reporter at NextGov, which is part of GovExec, also known as a wonky trade publication. So I'm happy to be here. I am actually going to have my esteemed panelists introduce themselves. Let's start with that. If you could just give us your name, intro, and then maybe how you have been working with or thinking about AI in this space.
Thanks so much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Darren Webb. I am the co-founder and CEO at Mindset. What we do is we assist those with the mental illness and their caregivers in applying for Social Security disability benefits. Kind of like to say that we've turbo-taxed the process for the consumers that are applying for benefits. Started the company after personally trying to assist my brother, who's battling schizophrenia and applying for benefits. Got in touch with 2 local disability attorneys who mailed me about 2 to 3 pounds of paperwork. I asked them if they could docu-sign it to me, and they had no clue what I was talking about. So at that very moment, I knew that we had to take this analog process and essentially digitize it, and that's what we've done. About 75% of our current claimant base are applying for SSI. We partner with jails, prisons, hospitals, reentry programs, essentially anywhere that constituency is located. So this is something I focus on all day, every day, and
Good afternoon, Julia Simon-Mishel from Philadelphia Legal Assistance. I run the unemployment practice at Philadelphia Legal Assistance, which is a civil legal aid program in Philadelphia. I have been working in the unemployment field for over a decade now, but for the last 8 years or so have had a special emphasis on technology, specifically on how technology is updating the way these systems work and how it is both at times improving and at other times limiting access to benefits, specifically when we are overhauling entire systems at a time and putting in place new systems that are generally run by outside vendors and are all built, unfortunately, without much user-centered design. Of course, the AI question has come into play in the last few years more and more, especially as I think we haven't really talked about UI much today, but yesterday I mentioned that unemployment is historically underfunded at the administrative level in states across the country. And so, of course, administrative agency leadership are looking to AI as a way to be more efficient, as a way to cut costs. And while there are some interesting applications I think we'll talk about, we have a lot of concerns, especially as a lawyer who focuses on due process, about what it could bring.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tim Shaw. I'm the Director of the Benefits Transformation Initiative at the Aspen Institute Financial Security Program. Like the Academy, we're a convener. and one of the spaces we convene is around public benefits and benefits delivery generally, and how we can transform that system and improve it to make sure that it actually provides people the ability to comfortably afford everyday life and be the foundation for achieving their long-term financial security goals. One of the groups that we convene is a set of state public benefits executives, primarily secretaries of health and human services and labor, around what are the leadership barriers that get into the way of them actually making the changes they need to cut down the wait times or reduce the paperwork or get people off those long call lines. And when we got them together a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, to a person, when we asked them what was the thing that they needed our help figuring out, it was AI. It was, I'm getting all these vendors knocking on my door saying, I've got this brilliant new AI thing that's going to solve all your problems. And they're like, I know that's not true. But they didn't know exactly what to think about it, how to navigate that. And so we've been learning about that and convening for the past couple of years, and trying to get them the best information possible, both with them, but also some of the federal counterparts who helped write some of the guidance out of HHS and FNS last year. As part of that, I'm also on the advisory group for the Center for Public Sector AI that gets together an even broader set of states on this exact question, and tries to provide very specific tools to help state public benefits executives navigate those questions. So excited to get into the conversation.
Jack Smalligan, Urban Institute, and previously for many years OMB. I come to the issue from spending many years trying to improve the Social Security disability determination process, and just very mindful of the weaknesses and problems for claimants with the existing process. And so kind of saw the AI kind of context as both a kind of high opportunity but also high risk area, and Social Security being kind of a prime opportunity to kind of explore how to kind of balance those kind of risks with the opportunities.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ariana Aboulafia. I lead the Disability Rights and Technology Policy Project at the Center for Democracy and Technology. So Center for Democracy and Technology, also known as CDT, is a tech policy organization that thinks about civil rights and civil liberties in the digital age and what that looks like. The project that I lead essentially applies a disability rights lens to all of our work. So that includes work on technology and voting rights, worker rights. I do a lot of work on personal privacy and data privacy. I'm an attorney by training. My previous life prior to doing policy work was that I was a public defender. So most of my work has focused around disability advocacy and advocacy for those who are low income. Obviously, the use of AI and benefits sort of touches both of those. And most of my work sort of focuses on centering people with disabilities in these conversations. As most of y'all in this room know, folks with disabilities oftentimes are beneficiaries, and as are multiply marginalized people with disabilities. And so I try to focus my work on centering those individuals, and also very excited to be on this panel. Thanks for having me.
Well, it sounds like we have a lot to talk about. So I guess let's start with just making sure we're on somewhat of the same page as to what AI is. Let's start with that. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in. Tim, I know you have thoughts.
Sure. I'm happy to kick us off there. To get us all kind of level set, I would actually like to turn the question on the audience for a second. I want to see how many people here have opened up or played with one of the new LLMs, say ChatGPT or the new Meta tool, or, okay, keep your hands up. All right. Who here has complained about the, quote, algorithm in a YouTube app, where as you're seeing videos, are going and saying, I don't want you to direct ads towards me in that way before? Any additional hands there? All right. How many people have used Maps or Google Maps to get somewhere? Right? Okay. So this is all to say, congratulations. You have navigated an AI-filled world already. One of the points I want to make here is just that AI is actually not as new as it feels right now to us. There are new capabilities, there are important things that are driving a lot of change in how we deliver services. But as the fellow panelists here will attest, even in the public benefit space, you can look back 5, 10, 20 years and see places where the use of technology to automate decisions or make complex changes or develop content has already been used in our systems to change how we do work and how we do behavior. The Aspen digital team has a great set of work right now on demystifying AI and talking about it. And basically, AI is a broad term used for a bunch of different things that doesn't have a consistent definition, but incorporates a lot of things like machine learning or the large language models that we're talking about. When I talk about why this is important to us and like what's coming down the pike and why we are spending so much time about it, I kind of frame up AI as having 3 characteristics that make it a top tier issue for us. One is that these new capabilities, especially generating and dissecting content, is incredibly powerful. Now, again, that can be either good or very bad, but it's not arguable to say this isn't going to change a lot of how we do business in the coming year, but especially in the decades to come. The second thing I want to say that is maybe a little controversial is that this is inevitable. Like, we are going to be living in a space where we are already in a space where AI tools are all around us, but more and more and more, it's going to be a part of everyday interactions with technology. And the private sector is already moving much, much, much faster than we in the public sector and nonprofit sectors are in automating decisions and embedding it in everyday tools. It is also inevitable because of the pressure that our public benefits administrators and executives are feeling around the worker shortages that we've already talked about today, around the fact that they have backlogs for all these programs that we've talked about today, that their caseworkers are stressed out and quitting and they can't replace them because they have caseloads that are so huge. All of these things, in addition to not having a constituency that would actually advocate for hiring up what you need to do under old systems to change any of those things, are going to create massive incentives to automate because they have to. And because if we care about people getting benefits faster and having a seamless experience, they're going to have to adopt those technologies. And the last thing I say, to give a little bit of hope to this little rant I have, that this is changeable. AI isn't, and the market isn't going, especially in this space, is not going to drive on its own towards some sort of product nirvana or terrible thing that we have no control over. As I started this with, you all have navigated AI already. Our public benefits administrators and our policymakers have done so as well. And right now, the top priority for the people building AI tools is actually not this field. It's like the other places where they're making boatloads of money, which means that we have an opportunity as a field now to make some decisions about how to shape what tools and products actually come out of that market to actually help public benefits beneficiaries and the beneficiaries of social insurance programs.
I just want to add a little bit of context to that, which, to pick up on the point at the end, just to frame all of this, is yes, we are not the biggest money-making opportunity for these companies, which is also a problem because we often get the D teams. No, seriously, the products and the people who are working on these projects in the States are not the same people doing the highest level work. And I think it's important to kind of frame this entire conversation with, this is really complex technology in some ways, and we are still really bad at using much less complex technology to administer benefit systems. And so, sometimes it takes a second to really think through, there are ways we can use this, but we've proven we haven't been able to do it well with, again, less complex issues that have somewhat less landmines in them. And so that's kind of how I think about this whole conversation, is there are opportunities, but let's also think a little bit broader about kind of how we're getting to the kind of generative AI, the most kind of aggressive form that we're discussing, and kind of what that timeline has looked like.
Does anyone have anything to add before I throw something else at you?
I'll add something really briefly here, just on Tim's point on what is AI? One of the problems from a policy perspective, and a lot of my work does kind of think about policy, is that there is no agreed upon definition of AI, right? You had kind of mentioned it quickly, so I did just want to hammer in that is actually a bit of a problem, because it's difficult to regulate something if we can't first agree on well, what is it precisely that we're talking about, right? I think that there is potentially a bit of a misconception that when we're talking about AI, the thing we're talking about is generative AI or LLMs, or the term I often use is chatbots. In the public benefits context, chatbots are used. They are one of many forms of AI that are used, and I'm sure we'll get to that and talk about it later. But the fact of the matter is that it's so far beyond just generative AI, and it's been used much, much longer than, let's say 2 years ago, which is when I think GPT-3 sort of came onto the market. In my work in, attempting to mitigate harms for people with disabilities when they interact with AI, one of the messages that I put forward basically every single day is that, these technologies are incorporated into every part of your life, whether it's, again, voting or education or employment or public benefits. And so it's really important to raise awareness about what these tools are and also how they're being used, particularly in sort of high-risk contexts like healthcare, but also like public benefits.
Yeah, go for it. No, yeah.
I'm a bit more of the techno-optimist here. The word regulation in Silicon Valley over the next 4 years is not going to exist. And that's just kind of what you're seeing in the language coming out of the new administration. And I think you're going to see a rebrand in the word AI simply because there is no agreeable definition of what AI is. And they're going to rebrand it and make it friendly for everyone. Just like what Tim said, AI has been around for 20 to 30 years. It just wasn't available to the consumer. You were using it, but now you can control it. And I think the developers of these programs want to kind of get back to that so they can continue to build without, kind of the uproar from those that disagree with what AI is doing and where it's going, even if it's, helpful. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, let's get into some examples. Jack, I know you're familiar with SSA, to say the least. So could you talk to us a little bit more about any work they're doing with technology and AI to help us understand this a little bit more?
So I think it's important just to understand that what SSA is using right now is not generative AI. I mean, that they're thinking about how to use that, but really it's much more natural language processing, predictive algorithms, kind of tools that can help and augment the analysis of a disability examiner, and also just help them manage in a case file that might come in with 1,000 pages of medical evidence. And I think it's easy to kind of focus on the productivity potential of AI, because that's in the private sector, that's such a theme. But in the context of Social Security, I mean, I think to think about it as an opportunity to identify cases that should be allowed more quickly and identify kind of gaps in evidence that if the evidence is filled, you could make an allowance. And I think it's really important in terms of external oversight of how Social Security proceeds in the years ahead, that it not be used simply as a way of clearing out the backlogs by denying cases. And I think as SSA has been using it up to this date, I think it's really been, the intent has been very positive in terms of augmenting the work of the disability examiners. And as others have said, SSA has been using types of AI in terms of their compassionate allowances and correct disability determinations for many years. Imagine is sort of the latest tool, but that one obviously in a couple of years will probably be taken over by a newer generation of technology.
Yeah, and you are doing some work more broadly on SSA and AI. Could you remind us what that is and give us any preview of any findings if you're able to?
So I think it had been noted earlier that the Academy has a task force of which I think all of us are on. Chantel Boyens and I are the principal investigators of that. And so we have a draft report kind of looking at what SSA is doing now, looking at the potentials and the risks, and then identifying some principles that can help guide what SSA does in the future, as well as guardrails that should be in place to help kind of protect the claimants and beneficiaries. And our intent by focusing on Social Security is to focus on a very concrete and very high risk area. I mean, a disability determination, I think, has so many potentials for bias and other types of unintended kind of influences on the claims processing decision. And I think we saw this as an opportunity to focus in on that kind of high-risk area to develop these principles and guardrails.
Well, I'm sure most people in the room are looking forward to seeing what you guys put out. Darren, you've identified yourself as the techno-optimist on this panel. So I'm curious if you would also tell us a little bit about your work and how you have been using AI.
Yeah, definitely. Without AI, we would not be able to be at the size we're at, impacting and helping the amount of people that we do on a daily basis. It just simply wouldn't be able to happen. We get, thousands of inbound calls daily, thousands of text messages, thousands of emails. That's all been automated through the use of AI. They are getting responses from our AI bot that has feeling, that has empathy, has been trained carefully. And, I think with the use of AI and its ability to touch the consumer, it needs to know when to pull back and let a human to allow them to take over. We understand that it's not up to our AI to go through the process with the claimant, 24/7, but just to give the case manager or the intake specialist some room and a break. When it comes to pre-qualifying a claimant, that shouldn't be an hour phone call anymore, right? It's 10 minutes. And if it needs to be leveled up to a human, that can happen. Writing briefs for our disability attorneys that go in front of the administrative law judge, to write a brief and review 2,500 medical records, that's time consuming. Our bot can get that done in about an hour. So, AI for us internally is used just to give back time to humans, essentially give them more arms to make bigger impact.
And could you give us a little bit of detail for people who aren't familiar with your work? You said when you introduced yourself that you've tried to sort of TurboTax disability applications. So how did you even do that? What does that look like? It's
just a really easy to use user interface. It's an application. Anybody can log in, pre-qualify in 5 to 10 minutes. We request your medical records automatically after we figured out that you're pre-qualified. And I figured out that 90% of all inbound calls and messages from claimants, they just want updates on their claims. It's really easy to log into the app, get an update on your claim, or the bot will proactively tell you. And it's a really good application to go through the entire, unfortunately, 24-month process. If you have to go to an ALJ to stay on top of your case, give us information as needed, or we can proactively go out and get it.
Yeah. Who else has examples of where AI is being used in this space and how?
Yeah, there are a couple that on both the kind of opportunities and the risk sides that I'm happy to highlight. Beyond the set of vendors that are trying to sell stuff to states and the federal government, there's also a set of nonprofit civic tech organizations who are really trying to dig in and leverage their past expertise in the private sector on this to build new tools for folks. The U.S. Digital Response is one of those places. And one of the things they're exploring is how to improve translation services for applicants who are trying to navigate public benefits systems and doing a lot of testing there. I think there are a number of issues that could come from not doing a good enough job in making sure those translations are done well. But I'll add, beyond the folks who are kind of on that first or second tier of languages, this one matters to me in particular because my mom was a Vietnamese immigrant and is now in the multilingual education space. And while people who speak Spanish, or maybe the second most common non-English language in the US, might have the chance to get an English, a translator of their language on the phone. If you get anywhere below that, that's not possible. AI is the only tool that I could imagine providing that level of access to folks who would come to this country and be able to navigate those systems. On the flip side, there have been attempts to use AI early to make eligibility decisions or to root out fraud that have proven unsuccessful and discriminatory. Michigan had a particularly bad case in 2016 or 2017 where they bought a tool that tried to root out fraud and found out after the fact that 70% of the cases that they denied were actually legitimate and had to go back and give $21 million back to people and back payments years after they had made those poor decisions. And so like this goes both ways. Other use cases that we are seeing are helping caseworkers navigate particularly complex decisions, especially when people qualify for multiple benefits. A lot of caseworkers in the states we work with have large workforces that are only under a year on the job. They don't have a lot of experience. And getting any assistance navigating all the different internal documents and guidance on how the federal program interacts with the state, interacts with other programs, is not a thing that's been rolling out yet, but they're doing a lot of testing right now to both help make good decisions, but also help with the workload challenges that come along with those sorts of determinations.
I saw some nods when Tim mentioned risks.
So I was actually going to say that I think this is a great example of the limited success in terms of things we think are working well in current use cases, because Tim and I both thought of the same good example separately. We did not discuss this. USDR language model was what I was going to say too. So I think that really tells us something. And I think that one thing about that model is that it's user-centered design. They are working with real people to test the model, and that is so important. And that is a step that's often missed in a lot of the technological development that's being done in public systems. I think it's good to discuss kind of what we think the good use case is generally for this. I think the private sector kind of example or nonprofit example of helping people access systems is really important. I think it becomes a little bit more difficult when it's the government using it to evaluate people or to assess risk or assess fraud. And for me, I think where I see the greatest potential to increase access, right? Because I think I'm part of the tattoo club of eligibility doesn't equal access, and technology is a large part of that, is using AI or other automated tools in situations where if it goes wrong, someone isn't harmed. They won't be in a worse place than they were without the AI. It's often referred to as like happy path automation, right? And that's where you can, I think, sometimes use things to clear issues, right, that don't need to be adjudicated, and to move people through a process. And so that's one place where I think we can see it used in a way that really takes kind of harm prevention principles into place. But I don't think that's often where we've seen it used as much. But I think that, to me, that is the use case that I'd like to see.
Yeah, and that is actually one of the guardrails that we've kind of identified in this, as well as a variety of others. Yeah.
As far as risk, something I think of every single day, I have 3 meetings a week on this, is data leakage. At the end of the day, all AI is data, and it's showing trends in that data, nothing more, nothing less. That's why there needs to be a rebrand. But we are all relying on third-party applications to power this AI. So just staying on top of all security protocols, latest trends, security patches, and updates, I think is one of the most important things.
And I'll add in quite a few sort of things here. I would say that risks of various AI tools in various contexts are sort of the center of a lot of my work. Before I dive into that, though, I do want to be clear that, AI chatbot tools even algorithmic tools, they can be quite helpful in this context and in other contexts for people with disabilities. A big context, it's a little outside the purview of this, but I'll throw it out there because it's tangentially related, is, lots of people with disabilities, they use AI-enabled assistive technologies, right? And those can be helpful even when someone is applying for benefits, right? Especially if they're doing so online. And so it isn't that I'm going to promote looking at these tools with a negative outlook, but more just to sort of be in mind of some of the risks. And there are risks at sort of no matter what type of AI is being used, right? So the chatbots are a good example. Chatbots can provide information that's incorrect. They can provide information that either quote unquote hallucinates, meaning like it just kind of pulls something out of nowhere, or that it's just wrong on. And I did a study with a couple colleagues late last year, and it was in the elections context, where we queried 5 major chatbots about questions about voting with a disability. And those chatbots were wrong about 2/3 of the time. And all 5 chatbots that we queried hallucinated, meaning like just pulled something out of nowhere at least once. And to be clear, right, that was in a different context. But in this context too, when public benefits agencies are using or thinking of using chatbots for things like customer service, it should be thought of that sometimes they can provide information that's not right. And that happened in New York City, right, where they use a chatbot and it provided some wrong information. And, for whatever it's worth, I thought of the same example as Tim. That was the bad example, which is the Midas example in Michigan for unemployment, right? So maybe we have very few good use case examples, and maybe we also have the same few sort of really scary ones, and maybe that's a good thing too, right?
Can I add here, just like to take a step back? I honestly think one of the reasons we have so few use cases is because there aren't many use cases at all out there right now in this broad category. We had the Center for Public Sector AI had its inaugural flagship convening last summer. We got over 25 state human services executive teams together to do demos with contractors, to have experts in the nonprofit space, US Digital Response, at the table answering their questions. And when they walked in, we did some polling. It was like, what do you think about this? Do you think you're going to be able to come out of this using something? And where do you think the state of the field is? They kind of gave an answer like they walked in thinking there was going to be products they were going to buy off the shelf. Then we did demos, and then we debriefed afterwards. We did a poll, and the biggest change was that they're like, these people haven't really built anything yet. And actually, what we need to do is not like have preconceived notions about what the use case, but the opportunity right now is to build it with them and make sure they are not screwing it up. Use my expertise as a public benefits expert on the front end to build the new use cases coming up and make sure we're using user-centered design, making sure we're building those feedback loops, making sure we're attentive to the risks before they get to the point where they're selling us something off the shelf and we have no control over that yet, right? That's the moment the field is in right now for all of the money going in. And what I worry about, I can come off as a techno-optimist on these panels just because I'm not focused on the risks as much, but I actually think I'm just a pessimist in a different way. What I'm worried about is that in 10 years, the common experience with a private sector customer service line is going to be, I call up FedEx, who I had to go through 3 different people this week for half an hour to find out how to get a receipt, right? This literally happened to me on Tuesday. In 10 years, that's not going to be the case. They're going to route me to their AI bot. It's going to give me an answer in 2 minutes, and it's going to email me something automatically. If at that time, we're still in the spot that we're talking about today, that Kathleen talked about, where I'm calling up SSA to navigate my Social Security benefit or my disability claim, and I'm on hold for an hour and a half when no other organization in my life makes me do that, what is that going to do to the trust in our system? When we go back to them and say, oh, and also SSA should run a long-term care plan, what are they going to say to us, right? They're going to say you're out of your mind. This is the type of thing we need to focus on. It's not, we need to talk about the big policy, and I know there are bigger risks right now that we are all attentive to. But this is a real long-term risk that if we don't focus on delivery, then we're gonna have the same trust problems and never gonna be able to achieve the long-term changes in these systems that we want. I loved the video earlier today about what Social Security meant to, I think it was Elizabeth. But in addition to saying this mattered a lot for her, she was like, and that check comes on time. She said on time like 3 times in that 2-minute clip, right? Like that's important. And we gotta be on time. We gotta deliver well. And that needs to be as important to us as some of these larger policy conversations that we're having.
Yes, I agree with everything that Tim's just said, but I think going back to this question of why do we have so few examples of either good or bad, and I think part of what our task force report wants to call out is the need for independent evaluations on what agencies are doing, and I think unfortunately SSA I think is lacking in this area, and I think without sort of an ability to evaluate these kind of new applications against what in many cases is a very flawed current process, a process that has bias involved, that's not transparent, and how do you objectively compare that to this new world that we're entering into and understand the weaknesses and the strengths of both?
Darren, I'd love your perspective as someone who actually works with this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think Tim, just to echo what he said, it's we're in the customer service business, nothing more, nothing less, and everything we do has to be claimant focused and towards the customer. As a representative, when we call Social Security and it takes us 46 minutes to get through to speak to someone, that is just not how it should be. And the claimant's relying on us to keep up with their claims. And your example of 10 years, it's going to be 2 years. But if, maybe 10
I was just trying to hedge my bets to make a good
there we go.
prediction.
I think Social Security, they're a massive agency, but there does need to be change, and hopefully private companies that are successful and they do see a little bit of light at a smaller scale, they can learn how to iterate.
Yeah, I mean, I'll triple down on that particular aspect, since in the unemployment world, we still have folks in states waiting 3 hours on the phone to get through to someone. But going back to kind of why we don't necessarily have as many use cases, so stepping kind of a little bit further back from, let's say, the generative AI or the kind of learning models, there has historically been a question and a challenge about what technology is even being used by government. Especially at the state level. There's a severe lack of transparency about this, some intentional, some unintentional, because a lot of times there is not the expertise within the state agency to even know what they are using. I cannot tell you the amount of times that I have heard from state agency officials, I don't know how it works and I don't want to know how it works, right? It's a black box for a reason. And that's really dangerous. And I think in places where, especially advocates on the ground, are not necessarily paying close attention to how decision-making is being done in different programs, we are missing where this is happening, especially because vendors have been selling various tools for a very long time. And so I think that's why the question of guardrails is so important, that if we're going to start looking at building these tools, considering what those guardrails are, and transparency is a top one. A lot of my work around AI has come from the fraud world, given the unique challenges from pandemic unemployment programs during the pandemic. And what we have consistently lacked there is transparency and, I would say, third-party accountability, right? Folks who can evaluate and verify what is being used, who are not government and who are not the private vendor. And a lot of times what you hear from folks is, well, we can't share how this works or what we're using because then the bad guys will know. And I would like to push back and say there are ways to do that without publicly putting it out there for everyone, including the bad guys, to know. And I think we have to figure out what those models look like.
I want to give a shout out to an organization called, I think it's Humane Intelligence. Raman Chowdhury runs it. She does both red teaming in the public interest, nonprofits, to sort out some of the problems you're describing. It also has this bias bounty program where they ask technologists to go into these like public use AI systems and like hunt out the bias to then just communicate it to the agency and say like, this is what we found, you should fix that. And this is not a pushback, this is a yes and. I think like we want to talk about guardrails all the time, but the solution to the problem that states don't have the technical expertise is not guardrails. If they don't have the expertise, they're not going to effectively use the guardrails, right? The problem is what Wendell said earlier today, is that when he's running a budget appropriations meeting, there's no one coming to him and advocating for like more technical expertise. When advocates go to states, they're not, I don't think, saying, you need a CTO who knows what the heck they're doing, right? And like, that needs to be as important a priority. If you want a state to hold vendors accountable, we need to push towards making sure they have the expertise to do that at all. And that is also a federal problem, right?
Ariana, you've looked like you've wanted to say something.
Oh, well, I always have something to say, but no, I was mostly listening to my colleagues on this. I mean, I think that one of the thoughts that I've had that maybe you were reading and picking up on is, you know, I think almost kind of what Tim's talking about is kind of like how to build a better AI, right? And you were mentioning the importance of centering experts, right? Like people who know what they're doing, to use your words. And I think that means not only centering people with expertise in technology, but also centering the beneficiaries, right? Like the folks who are going to be the most impacted by these decisions. And I think that's most important actually in the context of public benefits and things like healthcare that are really sort of high risk, right? Because I think when you involve the people, you know, people with disabilities and multiply marginalized people with disabilities and low-income people with disabilities, when you involve those folks, and Tim, this is kind of what you mentioned, right? But something I talk about a lot is at all stages of the technology. And that means development, it means procurement and pre-deployment auditing and post-deployment auditing. And every single implementation, right? It means involving them and also ensuring that they are actually heard, right? Because those are two different things. It's one thing to say, you know, we checked a box, we included a beneficiary here. And it's quite another to actually ensure that their perspective is centered. And the same thing goes for those with expertise with technology. I think that the lack of expertise in technology is something that will probably be solved because it's a growing field. And I can attest that it's a growing field. Part of what I do every day is I speak to folks in law school or in undergrad, and people are interested in AI. I think it's still a hot topic. I think it will continue to be. But as we do that, and as we sort of build out the field of people who, you know, to use Tim's words, who know what they're talking about on the tech, we can't lose sight of that person-centered impact because the tech doesn't exist in a vacuum. The tech is being applied to this extremely, incredibly important thing, and I think that's really important as well.
If I could just add to the challenge with agency expertise, because I think it can be easy to say, well, okay, this is an obvious one, we need to contract this out and let a vendor devise the AI system. And I think the Center for Democracy and Technology has done some kind of really good papers on the risks around relying sort of largely or entirely on contractors for developing these in terms of the lack of transparency and a whole variety of other considerations. And so I think as much as I think it's important to bring in the private sector in some roles, I think it's really, I'd call out the work that CDT has done to help kind of show how it's not a cure-all.
I just want to kind of agree with the comments were just made to kind of build off of Tim's point. Actually, my number one guardrail is to include stakeholders, right? That to me is the primary way of providing some sort of accountability and transparency, and it has to be mandatory. It can't be voluntary. The type of information sharing that comes from the government for a mandatory, some sort of stakeholder review board, stakeholder advisory committee, is very different than what you get in a voluntary situation. And I agree, it has to be at every step of the way. And there has to be a public record of what the stakeholders raised in terms of concerns, how that was addressed. I just think as we build these systems, we need that type of accountability. And I've served on something like that in Pennsylvania, and there were things we identified for the state agency within the product they had purchased that we prevented from going live that were hugely problematic and would have just gotten past everyone without folks in the room who understood what lived experience was and how folks actually navigate these systems.
Can I add just one addition there, which is I do think we want to have at all times the North Star and goal of these systems in mind at the beginning. And we are big boosters of person-centered approaches. We have a community advisory group that we bring all of our work to talk about how does the recommendations we are putting out into the world, the convenings we're having, how are they received by folks who have experienced financial insecurity. But another field I've also worked in is housing. And a huge amount of the reviews and like the way that we have tried to involve every stakeholder has led to the housing crisis in the country. That like we cannot build enough homes. We cannot build enough affordable homes for people. And I would just want to make sure that we don't handicap our agencies and make them again unable to develop and execute good technology by evaluating them to death. Right? There are good ways to do that, and we need accountability and we need person user-centered approaches. But we can't be so risk averse that we take forever to deploy these systems.
I think we could really be here all day talking about this, but I did want to ask before we have to finish, if you've read the news at all, you've probably heard about Elon Musk. Don't know if you've heard of him, but and the work he's doing with the Department of Government Efficiency. I've reported a little bit, and so have a ton of other people, on how technology is apparently going to be part of that, and presumably AI. So for anyone unfamiliar, the big stated goals are cost cutting, cutting regulations, cutting workforce. So I'm curious, how does the DOGE fit into these conversations right now about AI and benefits, or what are your thoughts?
I'll just be quick here. You know, as a thought, Elon Musk, he owns a company called X, formerly Twitter. And if you remember, the first month he came in, he cut 80% of the staff. And, you know, everybody said, hey, you know, Twitter's going to go down the drain, and it hasn't. It's become more efficient. He went and found the best developers in the world to build out AI systems and to automate a bunch of things. And technically, Twitter's actually doing, you know, or X now, excuse me, is doing as best as it ever has. You know, I don't know, obviously, what their plans are, you know, within the benefit space. It is unfortunate that, you know, many people will lose their positions and lose jobs. But if their goal is to go out and hire and find the best talent to come in and make things more efficient, hopefully, as a customer service job, which, you know, SSA should be, it affects the end consumer in a positive way.
Jack, do you have any thoughts?
I just think it's really unfortunate that improving services to clients and beneficiaries isn't like first and foremost in that list that DOGE summarized. And because if you look at the Social Security program, I mean, the backlogs SSA is facing right now are just, I mean, unimaginable 10 years ago, I think. I mean, it's like we've gone from 500,000 people waiting at the initial stage to like 1.2 million, and waiting for 7 months for initial determination, 7 months again for redetermination, and then years for an ALJ hearing. It's just people, the hardship on the claimants is just hard to understate. And so the opportunity with AI potentially is to generate some productivity savings and reinvest that in people addressing these backlogs, but at the same time, identifying cases where we don't have enough medical evidence, that a claimant is coming in who is in a healthcare desert or is uninsured and doesn't have really the medical justifications to be allowed, and is being denied not because they aren't eligible, but because there hasn't been enough work done on the case. And so if we can reveal where SSA needs to be doing more work to develop the case I think that becomes an opportunity for the claimant.
And does that always cut jobs?
I mean,
Or
that's,
just-
yeah, that could actually lead to more work on some of these cases, absolutely, yeah.
So I don't think any of us will argue that there are some efficiency issues in our state and federal government programs. I think it is very difficult to try to solve that with technology if you don't understand the underlying program well. And I have some strong concerns about bringing in folks to do that, and I think we've seen that happen in the federal government at times before. What we've seen when we've looked at different, especially UI systems, is that a lot of the efficiency issues actually come down to business practices. And what has happened is that we've bought technology or used technology to paper over those bad business practices. In essence, it just expands upon those bad business practices instead of sitting down and saying, what are the business practices? What would we like them to be? What would be most efficient? And then building technology to do that. I think other concern with something like this is the loss of human personnel in agencies. And as much as I understand wanting to call and get the chat bot to get you the answer right away, and I like that when I'm using things in the private sector, the number one thing my clients want at the end of the day is to talk to a human. I just can't tell you that is what people want, especially when they are in often a traumatic situation. They are dealing with many different things in their lives. They are trying to access benefits that keep them in their home, keep food on the table. They want to speak to a person. And we cannot underestimate that. And I think what sort of damage will be done to the long-term viability and trust in these systems if you get to a point where you cannot speak to a human. And I know we are somewhat there now, and that is part of the problem. But I worry about getting even further down that road.
I think we got to do both. I mean, look, I'm not a Doge optimist or even agnostic. I think it's going to go pretty poorly. Just to be direct about it, maybe more direct than I ought to be. And the way I think we ought to use technology is to get humans who should still be talking to people in crisis who are in the worst positions. Get them out of talking to people who don't have those sorts of problems. Let those people use the really good automated systems, and then reserve that time to really work with the people who need a person on the phone. That's the ideal space. But we often scapegoat technology for policy decisions. People have made, when we saw the pandemic and we looked at some of the states that were having long lines, and we looked at how they'd rolled out technology before. There's good reporting in Politico about UI in Florida, right? It wasn't about that, oh, we didn't know how the technology or database or systems are going to be used. They're we designed this so it would be difficult to use to lower the rolls. And that's not a tech problem. That's a policymaker problem, right? So if we shouldn't fight with the tech if the problem is the policy. But the other thing I'll say about Doge and about what's going to happen is none of us can predict what the next 4 years are going to look like. But if it turns out that the policy goal of some of this tech isn't to improve things, it's actually to clear out a bunch of stuff, and that we end up in a space where we've lost a lot of human capital, lost a lot of capability, at some point we will be in the position to have a say about how that stuff has to be rebuilt, I think. And maybe a good portion of what we need to be doing now is thinking about what would we want to rebuild that into, instead of worrying about the minutia of what they're going to do right now. And what I would say is that the position we don't want to be in is be the people who say, well, we're just going to rebuild it exactly like it was before all this happened, because it's not good right now.
I think we have time for an audience question, or maybe two. Oh, I see someone way in the back. I think a mic is coming to you. And I'll say while the mic gets there, put your hand back up, if you will. Yeah. That if anyone in this room, yeah, there you go.
Hi, I'm Fred Riccardi from the Medicare Rights Center. This is a really basic question for Darren. Could you talk a little bit about the cost? And did you see the cost of using the models evolve depending on how much you were using, how much information was given, et cetera?
Definitely. We tap into a few different models. The price is, kind of year over year continuing to go down. I don't know if you just saw what happened this past weekend with DeepSeek, the new LLM that came out of China, where they were able to create a model with $5 million versus billions that have been spent. I think NVIDIA lost almost $500 billion in market cap because of that news. It's now a race to the bottom. Again, I think in a few years, these tools will be commoditized essentially, and we'll just continue to see them be cheaper, which is obviously better for us at the end.
Well, I think that's it then. I appreciate it. Thank you all, and let's give it to the next panel.